The big glass doors of the Grandview Country Club opened wide. Rich people walked in wearing expensive clothes. The women had on shiny dresses and diamond jewelry. The men wore black suits that cost more than most people made in a month. Tonight was the annual charity auction. It was the biggest event of the year for the wealthy people in the city. Marcus Wellington stepped out of his silver Rolls-Royce. He was 45 years old and very rich. He had made his money from computer companies. Marcus liked to show off his wealth. He wore a custom-made suit that cost $15,000. His watch was worth more than a house. Marcus smiled as he walked into the club. He loved these events because everyone looked at him and knew he was important. The main hall of the country club was decorated with flowers and lights. Waiters in white uniforms carried trays of champagne and expensive food. The guests talked and laughed loudly. They spoke about their vacation homes, their new cars, and their business deals. This was their world. They felt safe here with other rich people. In the center of the room sat something very special. It was a grand piano made in 1925. The piano was black and shiny. It was a Steinway Model M, one of the finest pianos ever made. The auction house said it was worth $180,000. A small sign next to the piano told its history. It had belonged to a famous musician who played concerts all over the world. Marcus walked over to the piano. He ran his hand along its smooth surface. Several people gathered around him. Marcus loved having an audience. He began to tell them about his own piano skills. "I have been taking piano lessons for 3 years now," Marcus said in a loud voice. "My teacher charges $500 per hour. He says I have natural talent. I practice on my own Steinway at home. It cost me $200,000. The people around him nodded and smiled. They were impressed, or at least they pretended to be. Marcus continued his story. "Music is not something everyone can understand," he said. "It takes culture and education. It takes money to afford the best teachers. These common people walking around the streets, they could never appreciate real music. They listen to that noise on the radio and think it is art." Mrs. Patterson, an older woman with white hair, agreed with him. "You are so right, Marcus. Good music is for people like us, people with class and education." Marcus felt proud. He liked being seen as an expert on music and culture. He did not notice that some people walked away when he started talking. They found him annoying, but they would never say it to his face. Marcus was too rich and powerful. While the rich people talked and laughed, other people worked to make the event happen. Waiters carried heavy trays. Cooks worked in the hot kitchen. Cleaners made sure everything looked perfect. These workers were invisible to the guests. The rich people looked right through them as if they were not even there. David Chen was one of these workers. He was 26 years old and worked as a janitor at the country club. David was thin and tired-looking. His hands were rough from cleaning and hard work. He wore a simple uniform with his name tag that said David, maintenance staff. David had been working at the club for 2 years. He cleaned the floors, emptied the trash, and washed dishes. The pay was not good, but he needed the job. David sent most of his money home to help his sick mother. He also helped pay for his younger sister's school. Tonight, David was working extra hours because of the big event. He carried a tray of dirty glasses from table to table. He moved quietly, trying not to disturb the guests. Most of them did not even look at him. To them, he was just another worker doing his job. But David was different from what people thought. As he worked, his eyes kept looking at the beautiful piano in the center of the room. Something about it called to him. The way the light reflected off its polished surface, the way it sat there waiting for someone to play it. David felt a deep sadness in his chest. The piano reminded him of things he tried hard to forget. David had not always been a janitor. Long ago, his life was very different. But that was the past, and the past was painful to think about. He pushed those memories away and focused on his work. Marcus was still talking loudly near the piano. He had attracted a bigger crowd now. People listened as he explained why expensive pianos were better than cheap ones. He talked about wood quality and string tension and other technical things. Most people did not understand what he was saying, but they nodded anyway. "The problem with most people," Marcus said, "is that they do not know real quality when they see it. They buy cheap instruments and think they are getting the same thing. But there is a huge difference between a real Steinway and some factory-made piano." David heard these words as he cleaned glasses nearby. He almost dropped the tray he was carrying. Marcus continued talking, not knowing that David was listening. I bet most of the staff here have never even touched a real piano. Marcus laughed. They probably think all pianos are the same. It would be funny to watch one of them try to play. They would have no idea what to do. The other guests laughed with Marcus. They found his comments amusing. David felt his face get hot with anger and embarrassment. He wanted to walk away, but he had work to do. He needed this job too much to cause any trouble. David continued cleaning while Marcus kept talking. The rich man seemed to enjoy putting down people who had less money than him. David bit his tongue and said nothing. He had learned to stay quiet around rich people. Speaking up only caused problems. As the evening went on, more guests arrived. The room filled with the sound of talking, laughing, and clinking glasses. The auction would start soon. People looked at the items they wanted to bid on. The piano remained the star of the show. Everyone agreed it was the most beautiful piece in the auction. David finished cleaning the glasses and moved on to other tasks. But his eyes kept returning to the piano. There was something about it that he could not ignore. It seemed to be calling to him, asking him to come closer. David shook his head and tried to focus on his work. He could not afford to dream about things that were not meant for people like him. Marcus Wellington stood near the piano like he owned it already. He was planning to bid on it tonight. He wanted to add it to his collection at home. Having such an expensive piano would show everyone how cultured and sophisticated he was. Marcus smiled as he imagined his friends' jealous faces when they saw his new piano. The stage was set for something that no one could predict. The rich people continued their party, completely unaware that their comfortable world was about to be shaken. David continued his quiet work, not knowing that his life was about to change forever. And Marcus kept talking loudly, not realizing that his cruel words would soon come back to haunt him. The night was young, and the real story had not even begun yet. The charity auction was about to begin. People found their seats at the round tables covered with white cloth. Waiters poured more champagne into crystal glasses. The room buzzed with excitement as everyone waited to see who would bid on the expensive items. Marcus Wellington sat at the best table near the front. He had paid extra money to get the premium seats. From here he could see everything clearly. More importantly, everyone could see him. Marcus loved being the center of attention. David Chen continued working in the background. He moved between tables, collecting empty plates and refilling water glasses. His supervisor, Mr. Rodriguez, had told all the staff to work extra fast tonight. Important people were here and everything had to be perfect. "Keep moving, David," Mr. Rodriguez whispered as he passed by. "These rich folks don't like to wait for anything." David nodded and kept working. He was tired, but he needed the overtime pay. His mother's medical bills were getting higher every month. His younger sister Maria needed new books for school. Every dollar David earned was important to his family. As David worked near Marcus's table, he could not help but hear the rich man's conversation. Marcus was talking to his friends about all the expensive things he owned. He bragged about his cars, his houses, and his art collection. "I just bought a painting last week for $500,000, Marcus said loudly. Most people don't understand real art. They look at it and see nothing but colors on a canvas. But people like us, we can see the deeper meaning. His friends nodded and made impressed sounds. David rolled his eyes as he cleaned nearby. He had seen Marcus's type before. Rich people who thought money made them smarter and better than everyone else. Marcus noticed David working close to his table. The young janitor was trying to be invisible, but Marcus had sharp eyes. He looked at David's uniform and name tag. An idea formed in Marcus's head. He smiled, but it was not a kind smile. "You know what I was thinking about?" Marcus said to his friends, speaking louder now. "That beautiful piano over there. I wonder if any of the staff here has ever seen a real piano before." David tried to ignore the comment and keep working, but Marcus was not finished. "I bet they've never touched anything that expensive in their whole lives," Marcus continued. "They probably think all pianos are the same, like those cheap keyboards you see in discount stores." David's hands tightened around the water pitcher he was holding. He wanted to say something, but he forced himself to stay quiet. He could not afford to lose this job. Marcus was enjoying himself now. He could see that David was listening, even though the young man pretended not to hear. Marcus decided to have some fun. "Hey you," Marcus called out directly to David. "Yes, you with the name tag. David, is it?" David stopped working and looked up. All eyes at the table turned to him. He felt his face get warm with embarrassment. "Yes, sir?" David said quietly. Marcus grinned. I was just telling my friends here about the piano. Have you ever seen one like that before? David glanced at the beautiful Steinway piano sitting in the center of the room. Its black surface reflected the lights like a mirror. For a moment, memories flashed in his mind, but he pushed them away quickly. It's very nice, sir, David said, trying to end the conversation. But Marcus was just getting started. Nice, that's all you can say? Do you have any idea how much that piano costs? No, sir, David lied. He knew exactly what it was worth. He probably knew more about that piano than Marcus did. Marcus laughed and looked at his friends. $180,000. That's probably more money than you'll make in 5 years. The people at the table laughed along with Marcus. David felt smaller with each word. He wanted to walk away, but his supervisor was watching. Mr. Rodriguez had warned all the staff to be polite to the guests. No matter what they said. Tell me, David, Marcus continued, have you ever played piano before? This question hit David like a punch to the stomach. He felt his heart start beating faster. Old pain rose up in his chest, but he forced it down. A little, sir, David said, hoping Marcus would lose interest. But Marcus's eyes lit up with excitement. He had found his entertainment for the evening. A little? Marcus repeated loudly. How wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a musician among the staff. More people started looking their way. David felt trapped. He wanted to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. Marcus stood up from his chair. He was tall and imposing in his expensive suit. David felt small in his simple uniform. I have an idea, Marcus announced to the room. Since David here says he can play piano, why don't we give him a chance to show us his skills? The room started to quiet down. People sensed that something interesting was happening. Marcus was known for his dramatic gestures, and everyone wanted to see what he would do next. I challenge you, David, Marcus said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. I challenge you to play that piano right there. David's mouth went dry. The room was now completely silent. Everyone was staring at him. He could feel dozens of eyes boring into him. Some people had already pulled out their phones, ready to record whatever happened next. Sir, I don't think that's a good idea, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. He took out a crisp $100 bill and held it up for everyone to see. I'll make it interesting, Marcus said with a cruel smile. If you can play something, anything at all, this $100 is yours. But when you fail, when you embarrass yourself in front of all these people, you'll prove my point about the difference between people like us and people like you. The crowd murmured with excitement. This was better than any auction item. They were about to see real-life drama unfold. David felt sick to his stomach. The $100 would help his family so much, but he knew Marcus was setting him up to fail. The rich man wanted to humiliate him in front of everyone. I really should get back to work, sir. David tried again, but Marcus was having too much fun to stop now. Oh, come on, don't be shy. Everyone here would love to hear you play. Wouldn't you, folks? Some people in the crowd called out encouragement, but David could hear the mockery in their voices. They expected him to fail. They wanted to see the poor janitor make a fool of himself. Marcus waved the $100 bill again. Look at this money, David. I bet you could use it. Your family could probably use it too. All you have to do is sit down at that piano and play something. How hard could it be? David's supervisor, Mr. Rodriguez, appeared at his side. The older man looked nervous. He whispered urgently to David, "Just do what he asks," Mr. Rodriguez said quietly. "These people tip well when they're happy. Don't make them angry." David felt trapped. If he refused, Marcus might complain to the club management. David could lose his job. If he tried to play and failed, he would be humiliated in front of everyone. But the money, his family really needed that money. Marcus sensed David's hesitation. He pressed his advantage. "What's wrong, David? I thought you said you could play a little. Or were you lying to me?" The word lying hit David hard. He had never been called a liar before. His grandmother had taught him that honesty was one of the most important things in life. "I wasn't lying, sir," David said, his voice stronger now. "Then prove it," Marcus challenged. "Play that piano. Show us what you can do." The crowd pressed closer. Someone called out, "Go on, play something." Another person laughed and said, "This should be good." David looked at the piano. It was so beautiful, so perfect. It reminded him of another piano in another life. His hands began to shake slightly. Marcus saw the shaking hands and smiled wider. "Look, everyone, he's already nervous. This is going to be even more entertaining than I thought." David closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about his sick mother at home. He thought about his sister Maria, who dreamed of going to college someday. He thought about all the bills piling up on the kitchen table. $100 would help so much. When David opened his eyes, something had changed. The fear was still there, but something else was growing stronger. A feeling he had not felt in years. It was anger, but it was also something more. It was the memory of who he used to be. "All right, sir," David said, his voice steady now. "I'll play your piano." The crowd erupted in excited chatter. Marcus clapped his hands together, delighted with himself. He thought he had won already. He could already imagine David fumbling with the keys, playing some simple children's song badly. It would be the perfect entertainment. David handed his cleaning supplies to another worker. He straightened his uniform and walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavy, like he was walking toward his doom. But he kept going. The beautiful Steinway piano waited for him in the center of the room. As David got closer, he could see his reflection in its polished surface. He looked small and insignificant in his janitor's uniform. But inside, something was awakening. Something that had been sleeping for years. David reached the piano bench and stopped. The room was completely silent now. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Marcus stood behind him, still holding the $100 bill, still smiling his cruel smile. David sat down on the bench and looked at the keys. They were perfect, white and black in their eternal pattern. His hands hovered over them, trembling slightly. It had been so long since he had touched a real piano. David's fingers touched the piano keys for the first time in over a year. The keys felt cold under his fingertips, but they also felt familiar, like coming home after a long, painful journey. For a moment, nothing happened. David sat frozen on the bench, his hands resting on the keys but not moving. The silence in the room was complete. Everyone waited to see what the young janitor would do. Marcus Wellington stood behind David with his arms crossed, still holding the $100 bill. His smile was wide and confident. He expected David to stumble through a simple song. Maybe "Mary Had a Little Lamb" or "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." Something embarrassing that would prove Marcus's point about the difference between rich and poor people. The other guests whispered quietly to each other. Most of them felt sorry for David, but they were also curious to see what would happen. Some people had their phones ready to record what they thought would be a humiliating moment. David closed his eyes and tried to calm his racing heart. Being at the piano brought back so many memories. Good memories and painful ones. He remembered his grandmother's small apartment with the old upright piano against the wall. He remembered the first time he had played a complete song without making mistakes. He remembered the day he got the letter accepting him to music school. But he also remembered the day everything fell apart. The day he had to give up his dreams and become just another working person struggling to survive. "Any time now, David," Marcus said loudly, making several people in the crowd laugh. "We don't have all night." David opened his eyes and looked down at the beautiful piano keys. The Steinway was much nicer than any piano he had ever played before. Its keys were perfectly balanced, its sound would be pure and rich. For a musician, playing this piano would be like driving a race car after years of riding a bicycle. David's supervisor, Mr. Rodriguez, stood at the edge of the crowd looking worried. He knew David was a good worker, but he had no idea if the young man could actually play piano. Mr. Rodriguez hoped David would not embarrass himself too badly. The country club needed to keep these rich guests happy. David placed his fingers in position for the opening of a piece he had learned many years ago. It was Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was not an easy song. Most piano students took years before they could play it well. But it was the first piece that came to David's mind, maybe because it was sad and beautiful at the same time, just like his own life. The first notes came out soft and hesitant. David was testing the piano, getting used to how it felt. The sound was incredibly pure and rich, much better than any piano he had played before. Several people in the crowd looked surprised. They had expected wrong notes and clumsy playing, but these first few notes sounded good. Marcus frowned slightly. This was not what he had expected. But it was still early. David had probably just gotten lucky with the first few notes. As David continued playing, his confidence began to grow. His fingers remembered the movements they had practiced thousands of times years ago. The muscle memory was still there, sleeping but not dead. Each note helped wake up the next one. The crowd grew quieter. The whispering stopped. People leaned forward to hear better. What was happening was not what anyone had expected. David's playing became stronger and more confident. The sad, beautiful melody of Chopin filled the room. His left hand played the deep bass notes while his right hand sang the melody. It was complex music, but David played it like he had been practicing it yesterday. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman with white hair, gasped quietly. She recognized the piece. She had heard it played by professional musicians at concert halls. But this young man in a janitor's uniform was playing it just as well as any professional she had ever heard. Marcus's confident smile was starting to fade. This was not going according to his plan. David was supposed to fail quickly and embarrassingly. Instead, the janitor was playing beautiful music that made Marcus look foolish for challenging him. David was lost in the music now. He had forgotten about the crowd, forgotten about Marcus, forgotten about his embarrassment. For the first time in years, he was doing what he was born to do. His fingers moved across the keys like they were dancing. Every note was perfect. Every phrase was filled with emotion. The Chopin piece had many different sections. Some parts were soft and gentle like a lullaby. Other parts were dramatic and powerful like a storm. David played them all with skill and feeling that came from deep in his heart. People in the crowd began to realize they were witnessing something special. This was not just good playing for an amateur. This was professional-level performance. Several guests pulled out their phones, but now they wanted to record the beautiful music, not a funny failure. Mr. Rodriguez watched from the side with his mouth open. He had worked with David for 2 years and never had any idea the young man could do this. David had always been quiet and hard-working, but he had never mentioned anything about music. As the piece continued, David's playing became even more confident. He added his own personal touches to the music, small changes that showed he truly understood what Chopin had written. His hands moved with grace and power across the keys. Marcus stood frozen behind David. The $100 bill in his hand now felt heavy and useless. He had meant it as a joke, a way to humiliate a poor worker. But David was earning that money and much more with every note he played. The music filled every corner of the room. It was sad and hopeful at the same time. It spoke of dreams lost and dreams that might still come true. Some people in the crowd felt tears forming in their eyes. They could hear the pain and beauty in David's playing. David reached the most difficult part of the piece. His fingers had to move very fast and hit many notes in perfect timing. This was the part where most amateur players would fail. Marcus held his breath, hoping David would finally make mistakes. But David's years of training showed. His fingers flew across the keys without missing a single note. The difficult passages sounded effortless, like he was just having a conversation with the piano. The crowd watched in amazement as the young janitor played music that most people could never dream of playing. Mrs. Patterson whispered to her husband, "That boy has real talent. I haven't heard playing like this outside of Carnegie Hall." Her husband nodded, equally impressed. "Where did he learn to play like that?" "He's just a janitor." Other people were having similar conversations. They were beginning to realize that their assumptions about David had been completely wrong. Just because he cleaned floors for a living did not mean he was uneducated or untalented. David continued playing, unaware of the conversations around him. He was in his own world now, a world where only the music mattered. His body swayed slightly with the rhythm. His face showed the emotions he was feeling through the music. As the piece moved toward its ending, David played with even more passion. The final section was triumphant and powerful. It was like the sun coming out after a terrible storm. His left hand played strong, steady bass notes while his right hand soared with the melody. Marcus's face had turned red with embarrassment and anger. His plan to humiliate David had backfired completely. Instead of making the janitor look foolish, Marcus had made himself look like a fool. He had challenged someone without knowing anything about their abilities. The crowd was completely silent now, except for the beautiful music. Even the waiters had stopped working to listen. Everyone in the room understood they were hearing something special. David played the final notes of the Chopin piece with perfect control and feeling. The last chord rang out in the silence, pure and beautiful. For a moment after he finished, no one moved. The silence was complete. Then, slowly, the applause began. It started with Mrs. Patterson clapping her hands softly. Then her husband joined in. Then more people began clapping. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding loudly. David sat at the piano bench, breathing hard. He could not believe what had just happened. He had not played music like that in years. It felt like waking up from a long, sad dream. Marcus stood behind him, still holding the $100 bill. His face was no longer smiling. He looked angry and embarrassed. The rich man had expected to humiliate a poor worker, but instead the worker had shown abilities that Marcus could never match. The applause continued for a full minute. People were not just being polite. They were genuinely impressed by what they had heard. Some people called out bravo and beautiful. David slowly turned around on the piano bench to face the crowd. He looked confused and overwhelmed. The applause was wonderful, but it also reminded him of everything he had lost. It reminded him of the dreams he had given up years ago. Marcus finally stepped forward and handed David the $100 bill. His hand was shaking slightly with anger. "There," Marcus said quietly so only David could hear. "You win this round. But don't think this changes anything. You're still just a janitor." David took the money with trembling hands. $100 was a lot of money for him, but it felt strange to take it. He had not played the piano for money. He had played it because the music was still alive inside him. The crowd was still applauding when something unexpected happened. Mrs. Patterson walked over to the piano. She was an elderly woman with kind eyes and expensive jewelry. She looked at David with respect and curiosity. David looked up at Mrs. Patterson, then at all the faces staring at him. The room was completely quiet, waiting for his answer. He had not talked about his past in years. It was too painful. But something about the way Mrs. Patterson asked made him want to tell the truth. "I learned a long time ago," David said quietly. "When I was younger." Mrs. Patterson smiled encouragingly. "You play like someone who had very good training. That kind of skill doesn't come from learning on your own." David nodded slowly. He could feel his heart beating fast. Talking about his musical past always brought back memories he tried to keep buried. "My grandmother taught me when I was little," David began. "She had an old piano in her apartment. It wasn't very good, but it worked. She made me practice every day after school." Marcus rolled his eyes. He was still angry about being embarrassed, and he did not want to hear some sob story about David's childhood. But other people in the crowd seemed interested. "Your grandmother was a music teacher?" asked Mr. Henderson, an older gentleman wearing an expensive watch. "No, sir," David replied. "She cleaned houses for rich families. But one of the families she worked for let her daughter take piano lessons. My grandmother would listen to the lessons and remember what the teacher said. Then she would come home and teach me the same things." Several people in the crowd looked surprised. The idea of learning music secondhand seemed impossible to them. They had always paid expensive teachers to learn new skills. Mrs. Patterson leaned closer. "That's remarkable. You learned just from what your grandmother remembered?" David nodded. "At first, yes, but when I got better, she found ways to pay for real lessons. She worked extra jobs, saved every penny. She wanted me to have chances she never had." The crowd was listening carefully now. Even some of the waiters had stopped working to hear David's story. This was not what anyone had expected from the evening. "How old were you when you started playing?" Mrs. Patterson asked. 5 years old, David answered. "My hands were so small I could barely reach all the keys. But my grandmother said music would give me a better life. She said if I could play piano well enough, I could go to college, maybe even become a professional musician." Marcus made a scoffing sound. "Professional musician? Come on. Do you know how hard it is to make money playing piano?" David looked at Marcus for a moment. "You're right, sir. It is very hard. That's why I'm working here instead of playing concerts." The sadness in David's voice made several people uncomfortable. They began to realize this story did not have a happy ending. Mrs. Patterson sensed David's pain. "What happened? Why aren't you playing music professionally?" David was quiet for a long moment. This was the part of the story he never wanted to tell. But he had come this far. Maybe it was time to let it out. "I was good enough," David said simply. "When I was 16, I got accepted to Juilliard School of Music in New York. Full scholarship. My grandmother cried when we got the letter. She said all her sacrifices had been worth it. Several people in the crowd gasped. Juilliard was one of the most famous music schools in the world. Getting accepted there was like winning the lottery for young musicians. "You went to Juilliard?" Mrs. Patterson asked with amazement. "For 2 years," David replied. "Best 2 years of my life. I learned from incredible teachers. I played with other students who were just as passionate about music as I was. I thought I was going to make it." "What happened?" someone called out from the crowd. David's hands tightened in his lap. "My grandmother got sick. Cancer. The medical bills were huge. My mother lost her job around the same time. My little sister needed to stay in school. Someone had to work to keep the family together." The room was completely silent now. Everyone understood where this story was going. "So I dropped out," David continued. "Came back home to work and send money to my family. I thought it would just be for a year, maybe 2. I thought I could go back to school when things got better. But things didn't get better," Mrs. Patterson said softly. "No, ma'am. They got worse. My grandmother died 6 months after I came home. My mother's illness got more serious. My sister needed help with college expenses. I kept working, kept sending money home. Years passed, I never made it back to Juilliard." David looked down at his hands. They were rougher now, scarred from years of manual labor, but they still remembered how to make beautiful music. "How long has it been since you played?" Mrs. Patterson asked gently. "Seriously? About 6 years. I've touched a piano maybe 5 times since I left school. There was one in the community center where I worked before this job. Sometimes I would play for a few minutes when no one was around, but not like this. Not a real performance." Marcus was listening despite himself. He had expected David to have some basic piano lessons as a child, not a story like this. The rich man felt uncomfortable, like maybe his challenge had not been as funny as he thought. 6 years, repeated Mr. Henderson. "And you just played Chopin like that after 6 years without practice?" David shrugged. "Music doesn't really leave you. It's like riding a bicycle. Your fingers remember what your mind forgets." "That's not just muscle memory," said Mrs. Patterson firmly. "That was artistry. You have real talent, young man. The kind of talent that shouldn't be wasted." David looked up at her with sad eyes. "Talent doesn't pay the bills, ma'am. My family needs me to work. They depend on the money I send home." The crowd was quiet, processing everything they had heard. Many of these rich people had never thought about the sacrifices poor families had to make. They had never imagined someone giving up their dreams to take care of others. Mrs. Patterson was not finished asking questions. "What was your specialty at Juilliard? What kind of music did you focus on?" "Classical piano performance," David replied. "I was preparing for concert performance, solo recitals, playing with orchestras, that kind of thing. My teachers said I had the technical skills and the emotional understanding to make it as a professional." "And you gave all that up," Mrs. Patterson said, more to herself than to David. "I had to," David said firmly. "Family comes first. Music is beautiful, but it doesn't keep people alive when they're sick. It doesn't pay for medicine or rent or food." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. He thought about his own expensive piano lessons, his $200,000 piano at home that he barely played. He had everything David had dreamed of, but he had never sacrificed anything for it. "Do you ever regret it?" asked a woman in a silver dress. David thought about the question for a moment. "I regret that my grandmother didn't live to see me graduate. I regret that things worked out this way, but I don't regret taking care of my family. They needed me more than the music world did." "The music world needs talent like yours," Mrs. Patterson said passionately. "There are so few people who can play with real feeling, real understanding. Most people can learn the notes, but they can't make the music come alive like you just did." David smiled sadly. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot. But I made my choice years ago. This is my life now." "It doesn't have to be," Mrs. Patterson said quickly. "There are ways to get back into music. Scholarships for older students, programs for people who had to interrupt their education." David shook his head. "I'm 26 now. Most professional musicians start their careers in their early 20s. I'm too old, and I've been away too long. Nonsense, said Mr. Henderson. 26 is young, and what you just played proves you haven't lost your abilities. Other people in the crowd began agreeing. They had been moved by David's story and impressed by his playing. Several of them were thinking about how they might be able to help. But David stood up from the piano bench, signaling that he wanted to end the conversation. Thank you all for listening, and thank you for the kind words, but I really should get back to work. My supervisor is probably wondering where I am. Mr. Rodriguez, David's supervisor, stepped forward. David, take a break if you need one. After what we just heard, I think you've earned it. David looked surprised. Mr. Rodriguez was usually very strict about keeping to work schedules. Mrs. Patterson was not ready to let David go. Wait, please. I have more questions. And I think there might be some people here who could help you. Help me with what? David asked. Getting back into music, Mrs. Patterson replied. Finding a way to support your family and still pursue your talents. David looked skeptical. That's very kind, ma'am, but I don't see how that's possible. I need steady work, steady income. Music is too uncertain. Not necessarily, said a man in a dark suit who had been listening quietly. There are ways to make good money in music. Teaching, performing for events, recording. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. David looked around at all the faces watching him. These rich people seemed genuinely interested in helping him. But he had been disappointed before. He had learned not to get his hopes up too high. I appreciate the suggestions, David said politely. But right now I need to focus on my job here. My family is counting on me. He started to walk away from the piano back toward his cleaning supplies. But Mrs. Patterson called after him. David, wait, just one more minute. I want to ask you something. David stopped and turned back to her. If money wasn't a problem, Mrs. Patterson said, if you could support your family and still play music, would you want to do it? After Mrs. Patterson defended David against Marcus, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. People were no longer just curious about the janitor who could play piano. They were genuinely interested in his story and wanted to help him. David stood near the piano, still holding the $100 bill Marcus had given him. He felt confused and overwhelmed. For years he had lived a simple life. Work, send money home, sleep, repeat. Now suddenly everyone wanted to talk to him about music and dreams and possibilities he had given up long. As Mrs. Patterson walked closer to David, she was an elegant woman in her 70s with silver hair and kind eyes. Her jewelry was expensive, but she wore it like someone who had been wealthy for so long that she forgot about money most of the time. David, she said gently, I know this is all very sudden, but I want you to know that I'm serious about helping you. I've been involved in supporting young musicians for 30 years. I know talent when I hear it. Other people began gathering around David and Mrs. Patterson. They wanted to hear more of the conversation. David felt nervous with so many rich people staring at him, but Mrs. Patterson's presence made him feel safer. What kind of help do you mean? David asked carefully. He had learned to be suspicious of promises from wealthy people. They often offered help but forgot about it the next day. Mrs. Patterson smiled. Well, first I'd like to know more about your current situation. You said you support your mother and sister. How much money do you need to send them each month? David hesitated. He did not like talking about money, especially with strangers. But Mrs. Patterson seemed genuinely interested in helping. About $1,500 a month, David said quietly. My mother's medical bills are expensive and my sister is in her last year of college. Several people in the crowd made sympathetic sounds. $1,500 was not a lot of money to them, but they understood it was everything to David's family. And how much do you make working here? Mrs. Patterson continued. About $2,000 a month, David replied. After taxes and my own expenses, I can send home about $1,500. It's tight, but it works. Mrs. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. So if you could make the same money or more playing music, you could support your family and still pursue your passion? David looked skeptical. Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but making money in music is very hard. Even good musicians struggle to find steady work. That's true for some types of music careers, Mrs. Patterson agreed, but there are other options. Private teaching, for example. Good piano teachers in this city charge $50 to $100 per hour. If you taught 20 hours a week, you could make more than you do here. David had never thought about teaching music. At Juilliard, he had focused on performance. But teaching might be more realistic than trying to become a concert pianist. I don't have any teaching experience, David said. But you have the skills, Mrs. Patterson replied. And teaching experience can be learned. Performance ability like yours cannot be taught to just anyone. Mr. Henderson, the man with the expensive watch, stepped forward. I have 2 children who need piano lessons. After hearing you play tonight, I would hire you immediately. A woman in a blue dress nodded in agreement. My daughter has been taking lessons for 3 years, but she's not improving much. Her current teacher is very expensive, but not very good. I would love to find someone with real talent to teach her. David looked around at the interested faces. These people seemed serious about hiring him as a teacher, but he still felt uncertain. Teaching is one possibility, Mrs. Patterson continued, but there are others too. Do you know about the Richardson Music Foundation? David shook his head. He had been out of the music world for so long that he did not know about current opportunities. It's a program I helped start 5 years ago, Mrs. Patterson explained. We provide grants and support to talented musicians who had to interrupt their careers. The goal is to help them get back into music without losing financial stability. This sounded too good to be true to David. What kind of support? Financial assistance while you rebuild your music career, help finding performance opportunities, connections with music schools and professional musicians. We've helped over 30 people get back into music in the past 5 years. David felt his heart start beating faster. This was the kind of opportunity he had dreamed about but never thought was possible. But I've been away from music for 6 years, David said. Wouldn't you want to help someone who was more recently active? Mrs. Patterson shook her head firmly. David, what you played tonight proves that your musical abilities are still very strong. 6 years is not that long in music terms. With some focused practice and the right opportunities, you could be performing professionally again within a year. A year? David repeated. The idea seemed impossible and wonderful at the same time. Maybe less, said a new voice from the crowd. A man in a dark suit stepped forward. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm Dr. James Mitchell from the City Music Conservatory. I heard your performance tonight, and I have to say it was remarkable. David recognized the name. The City Music Conservatory was one of the best music schools in the region. Dr. Mitchell was a famous pianist and teacher. Dr. Mitchell, Mrs. Patterson said with pleasure, I didn't know you were here tonight. I came with my wife, Dr. Mitchell replied, gesturing toward a woman near the back of the crowd. We were planning to bid on some of the auction items, but honestly, David's performance was better than the auction. Dr. Mitchell turned to David. Young man, I would like to offer you something. We have a program at the conservatory for advanced students who want to refresh their skills. It's designed for people exactly like you, musicians who had professional training but took time away from music. David could hardly believe what he was hearing. What kind of program? Intensive classes with our best teachers. Performance opportunities with our student orchestra. Help preparing for auditions and competitions. The program lasts 1 year, and there are scholarships available for people who need financial assistance. David felt dizzy. In one night, he was hearing about more opportunities than he had imagined in years. But he was also scared. What if he was not good enough anymore? What if he had been away too long? I don't know, David said hesitantly. This all sounds wonderful, but I'm not sure I'm ready. And I can't afford to stop working. My family needs the money I send them. Mrs. Patterson and Dr. Mitchell exchanged a look. They could see that David was interested but afraid to take the risk. What if we could solve the money problem? Mrs. Patterson asked. What if the foundation could provide you with enough money to support your family while you studied? David stared at her. You would do that? For someone you just met? David, Mrs. Patterson said seriously, I've been supporting young musicians for 3 decades. I've heard thousands of people play piano. What you did tonight was special. Really special. Talent like yours shouldn't be wasted because of money problems. Dr. Mitchell nodded in agreement. I've been teaching for 25 years. I can count on one hand the number of students who played with the combination of technical skill and emotional depth that you showed tonight. After 6 years away from the piano, David looked around at all the faces watching him. These people barely knew him, but they were offering him chances he had thought were gone forever. It was overwhelming and frightening and exciting all at the same time. I need to think about this, David said finally. This is all happening very fast. Of course, Mrs. Patterson said understandingly. These are big decisions. But David, will you at least consider it? Will you let us help you explore these possibilities? Before David could answer, Marcus Wellington appeared at the edge of the crowd. He had been watching and listening from his table, and he did not like what he was seeing. Marcus was used to being the center of attention at these events. He did not appreciate being upstaged by a janitor. This is all very touching, Marcus said in a loud voice. But let's be realistic here. David, these people are being very generous, but music is a risky career. You have a steady job here. You have responsibilities to your family. Are you really going to throw that away to chase some impossible dream? The crowd turned to look at Marcus. His interruption was unwelcome, and several people looked annoyed. Mrs. Patterson's eyes flashed with anger. Marcus, this young man has already proven tonight that his dreams are not impossible. He played one song, Marcus replied dismissively. That doesn't mean he can make a living as a musician. David, be smart about this. Take the compliments, but keep your day job. David felt his face flush with anger and hurt. Marcus was voicing all the fears David had been trying not to think about. What if he tried to return to music and failed? What if he let his family down? What if he was not as good as these people thought? But then David remembered how it felt to play the piano tonight. The joy, the sense of coming alive again, the feeling that he was doing what he was meant to do. For 6 years he had been just surviving. Tonight he had remembered what it felt like to really live. Mr. Wellington, David said, his voice steady and clear. I appreciate your concern, but I think I can make my own decisions about my life. Marcus looked surprised. The quiet janitor was standing up to him. As the crowd continued talking excitedly about David's performance and the opportunities being offered to him, more people began sharing stories about David that he had never expected anyone to notice or remember. Maria Santos, one of the waitresses who had worked at the country club for 5 years, stepped forward. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who had always been friendly to David, but had never had long conversations with him. Excuse me, Maria said to the crowd. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to say something about David. Mrs. Patterson encouraged her to speak. Please, go ahead. Maria looked at David with a warm smile. I've worked with David for 2 years. Most people here tonight are just meeting him, but I see him every day. I want you to know what kind of person he really is. David felt embarrassed. He did not like being the center of attention, and he was not used to people talking about him in front of others. David always works harder than anyone else, Maria continued. When other workers call in sick, David covers their shifts without complaining. When we're really busy, he helps in the kitchen even though it's not his job. He's never late, never causes problems, and he's always polite to everyone. Dr. Mitchell listened with interest. Character was important to him when choosing students for his program. But there's something else, Maria said. About 6 months ago, my son Carlos was having trouble in school. He was failing math and getting into fights. I was worried about him, but I didn't know what to do. David remembered Carlos, a quiet 12-year-old boy who sometimes came to the club after school to wait for his mother to finish work. David started talking to Carlos during breaks. Maria continued, not giving advice or lecturing him, just talking. About school, about life, about staying focused on goals. Carlos started doing better in school. His grades improved and he stopped getting in trouble. Mrs. Patterson looked impressed. David was mentoring your son? Without me even asking, Maria replied. Carlos told me that David explained how education was the key to having choices in life. How hard work always pays off, even if it takes time to see the results. My son really looked up to David. David shifted uncomfortably. He had enjoyed talking to Carlos, but he had not thought of it as mentoring. He had just tried to be helpful. There's more, Maria said. Last Christmas, David found out that Carlos wanted a guitar, but we couldn't afford one. David used his own money to buy Carlos a guitar for Christmas. A nice one, not a cheap toy. Several people in the crowd made appreciative sounds. David had never told anyone about buying the guitar for Carlos. When I tried to pay David back, Maria continued, he wouldn't take the money. He said Carlos reminded him of himself at that age. He said every kid deserved a chance to discover if they had musical talent. Mrs. Patterson looked at David with new respect. You bought a guitar for Maria's son? David shrugged. It wasn't that expensive, and Carlos seemed really interested in music. It was expensive for someone making your salary, Mrs. Patterson pointed out gently. Mr. Rodriguez, David's supervisor, had been listening to Maria's story. Now he stepped forward to add his own observations. "If I may," Mr. Rodriguez said, "I'd like to share something else about David's character." David wished everyone would stop talking about him, but he stayed quiet and listened. 3 months ago, we had a problem with one of our older workers, Mr. Rodriguez explained. Frank Martinez, who works in maintenance with David. Frank hurt his back and couldn't do heavy lifting for several weeks. He was worried about losing his job because he couldn't do all his duties. The crowd listened attentively as Mr. Rodriguez continued. David quietly took over Frank's heavy work without being asked. He did his own job plus the hardest parts of Frank's job for 6 weeks until Frank's back healed. David never complained, never asked for extra pay, never even mentioned it to me. I only found out because Frank told me what David had been doing. Dr. Mitchell nodded approvingly. This kind of character was exactly what he looked for in students. Frank is 58 years old with grandchildren, Mr. Rodriguez said. He really needed that job. David probably saved Frank from being fired, and Frank's family from serious financial trouble. David felt his face getting warm. He had helped Frank because it was the right thing to do, not because he wanted praise or recognition. Mrs. Patterson was becoming more convinced that David was exactly the kind of person her foundation should help. But she wanted to understand his background even better. "David," she said, "earlier you mentioned your grandmother. She sounds like she was very important to you.
Can you tell us more about her?"
David's expression softened when he thought about his grandmother. She had been the most important person in his early life. "Her name was Elena Chen," David said quietly. "She came to America from China when she was 20 years old. She didn't speak English well and she didn't have much education. But she was the smartest person I ever knew." The crowd listened as David's voice became warmer talking about his grandmother. She worked cleaning houses for rich families for 40 years. She never made much money, but she saved every penny she could for my music lessons. She believed that music would give me opportunities she never had. Mrs. Patterson felt a connection to the story. She had been wealthy her whole life, but she remembered the women who had cleaned her family's house when she was young. She had never thought much about their own families and dreams. Grandma Elena would listen outside the door when the children in the houses she cleaned took piano lessons, David continued. She would memorize everything the teacher said. Then she would come home and teach me the same lessons. She learned music just by listening? Dr. Mitchell asked with amazement. "She couldn't read music," David replied, "but she had an incredible ear. She could hear a song once and remember every note. She taught me to listen the same way." David paused, lost in memories of practicing with his grandmother in her small apartment. "When I got older and needed more advanced lessons, she found ways to pay for real teachers. She worked extra jobs, cleaned more houses, saved money from groceries. She never bought anything for herself. Everything was for my music education." Mrs. Patterson felt tears forming in her eyes. She was thinking about all the money she spent on things she didn't really need, while David's grandmother had sacrificed everything for her grandson's dreams. "She sounds like an amazing woman," Mrs. Patterson said softly. "She was," David agreed. "She used to tell me that music was a universal language. She said it didn't matter if you were rich or poor, educated or not. Music could touch anyone's heart. She said that's why I had to learn to play, so I could speak that language to the world." The room was quiet as people absorbed David's words. Many of them were thinking about their own grandparents, their own sacrifices and dreams. "What happened to her?" someone asked gently. David's expression became sad again. "She got sick during my second year at Juilliard. Cancer. The doctor said if we had caught it earlier, the treatment might have been successful. But she hadn't been to a doctor in years because she couldn't afford it." Several people in the crowd looked down at their expensive clothes and jewelry, feeling uncomfortable about the contrast with David's story. "She spent all her money on my education instead of taking care of her own health," David continued. "When she got sick, the medical bills were enormous. My family couldn't afford the treatment and keep paying for my school. So you dropped out to help pay for her care," Mrs. Patterson said, understanding the full picture now. "I tried to do both for a while," David said. "I worked part-time jobs in New York and sent money home. But it wasn't enough. I had to choose between my music education and my grandmother's life. It wasn't really a choice at all." Dr. Mitchell was deeply moved by the story. He had seen many talented students over the years, but few had faced such difficult circumstances. What did your grandmother say when you told her you were leaving school? Dr. Mitchell asked. David smiled sadly. She was angry at first. She said I was throwing away everything she had worked for. But when she realized how serious her illness was, she understood. In her last weeks, she made me promise that I would find a way back to music someday. Did you make that promise? Mrs. Patterson asked. Yes, David replied. But I thought it was impossible. After she died, I was so focused on supporting my mother and sister that I couldn't imagine how I would ever afford to go back to school. Mrs. Patterson reached out and gently touched David's arm. David, I think your grandmother would be very proud of what you did tonight, and I think she would want you to keep your promise to her. David looked around at all the supportive faces surrounding him. For years, he had felt guilty about giving up music. He had wondered if his grandmother's sacrifices had been wasted. But tonight, people were telling him it wasn't too late. There's something else you should know about David's grandmother, Maria said. She had been listening to the conversation and remembered something important. Everyone turned to listen to Maria. Carlos, my son, told me that David talks about his grandmother sometimes when they chat. David told Carlos that his grandmother used to say that the best way to honor someone's sacrifice is to live up to your potential. She said that wasting your talents was like throwing away a gift. The crowd around David was still buzzing with excitement and plans when Mrs. Patterson made an announcement that surprised everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, she said in a voice loud, enough for the whole room to hear. I have an idea. David has given us an incredible gift tonight with his music. I think we should return the favor. People turned to listen to Mrs. Patterson. David felt nervous about being the center of attention again. What are you thinking, Eleanor? Asked Mr. Henderson. Mrs. Patterson smiled. I'm thinking that David should play for us again, but this time not as a challenge or a test. This time, as the featured performer of the evening. The crowd murmured with excitement. David looked shocked. Mrs. Patterson, David said quickly, I don't think that's necessary. I should probably get back to work. Nonsense, Mrs. Patterson replied. David, you've given us something beautiful tonight. Let us give you something in return. The experience of performing for an audience that truly appreciates your talent. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward enthusiastically. Eleanor, that's a wonderful idea. David, performing for a supportive audience is one of the best ways to build confidence for future auditions and concerts. David looked around at all the expectant faces. Part of him was terrified at the thought of performing again. But another part of him, the part that had been sleeping for years, was excited by the possibility. What would you like me to play? David asked, surprised by his own words. Whatever you want, Mrs. Patterson said. Something that means something to you. Something that shows us who you really are as a musician. David thought for a moment. The Chopin piece he had played earlier was beautiful, but it was something he had learned in school. If he was going to play again, he wanted to play something more personal. There's a piece I used to play for my grandmother, David said slowly. It's not as famous as Chopin, but it meant a lot to both of us. What is it? Dr. Mitchell asked with interest. It's called Clair de Lune by Claude Debussy, David replied. My grandmother loved it because she said it sounded like moonlight on water. She said it reminded her of peaceful nights in China when she was young. Mrs. Patterson's eyes lit up. That's one of my favorite pieces. I would love to hear your interpretation of it. David walked back to the piano, feeling nervous but also excited. The room fell silent as he sat down at the bench. This time felt different from before. The first time he had been challenged and embarrassed. Now he was choosing to play because he wanted to share something beautiful. David placed his hands on the keys and began the opening notes of Clair de Lune. The piece started very softly, like moonlight beginning to shine through clouds. His touch was gentle and careful, each note floating in the air like a whisper. The room was completely silent. People barely breathed as they listened to the ethereal music. David's playing was even more beautiful than before because now he was relaxed and playing from his heart. As the piece developed, David's playing became more expressive. He used the piano's full range of dynamics, from barely audible whispers to rich, full sounds that filled the room. His hands moved with grace and confidence across the keys. Mrs. Patterson closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. She had heard Clair de Lune performed by professional pianists many times, but David's version was special. She could hear the love he had for his grandmother in every note. Other people in the crowd were equally moved. Some had tears in their eyes. Others swayed slightly with the gentle rhythm. Even the waiters and kitchen staff had stopped working to listen. Marcus Wellington stood at the back of the room, watching and listening despite himself. He was still angry about being embarrassed earlier, but even he had to admit that David's playing was extraordinary. Marcus was beginning to realize that his assumptions about David had been completely wrong. As David played, he felt himself transported back to his grandmother's apartment. He could almost see her sitting in her old chair, smiling as she listened to him practice. She had always loved this piece, and David had played it for her many times during her illness. The middle section of the piece became more passionate and dramatic. David's hands moved with increased intensity, but the music remained beautiful and controlled. He was telling a story through the piano, a story of love and loss and hope. David thought about all the conversations he had had tonight, about the opportunities being offered to him, about the possibility of returning to music, about keeping his promise to his grandmother. As he played, he felt her presence with him, encouraging him to be brave. The piece began to wind down toward its peaceful ending. David played with incredible tenderness, each note perfectly placed and timed. The final section was like saying goodbye to a beautiful dream, sad but also grateful for the experience. When David played the last note, the silence in the room was complete. For several seconds, no one moved or spoke. The music seemed to hang in the air like a blessing. Then the applause began. But this was different from the applause after the Chopin piece. This applause was deeper, more emotional. People were not just impressed by David's technical skill. They were moved by the beauty and feeling he had shared with them. The applause continued for several minutes. People called out, "Bravo!" and "Beautiful." Some were wiping tears from their eyes. David sat at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. Mrs. Patterson was the first to approach him. She had tears streaming down her cheeks. "David," she said softly, "that was one of the most beautiful performances I've ever heard. Your grandmother would be so proud." Dr. Mitchell was right behind her. "David, that was extraordinary. The way you played that piece with such emotion and understanding. That's what real musicianship sounds like." Other people crowded around David, offering congratulations and praise. Everyone wanted to tell him how much his playing had moved them. "David," said the woman in the blue dress, "I want to hire you to teach my daughter immediately. When can you start?" "I'd like to book you for my wife's birthday party next month," said Mr. Henderson. "Would you be available to perform?" "Our church definitely needs a new music director," added another woman. "Would you be interested in discussing it?" David felt overwhelmed by all the offers and opportunities. A few hours ago, his biggest worry was finishing his cleaning duties. Now people were offering him multiple ways to make money from music. Mrs. Patterson raised her hand to quiet the crowd. "Everyone, please give David some space. I know you're all excited to work with him, but let's not overwhelm him tonight." David stood up from the piano bench and faced the crowd. He felt like he needed to say something, but he wasn't sure what. "Thank you," David said, his voice slightly shaky with emotion. "All of you. I never expected anything like this when I came to work tonight. Your kindness and support mean more to me than I can express." The crowd listened attentively as David continued. "For 6 years I thought my music was dead. I thought I had given up my dreams forever. Tonight you've shown me that maybe it's not too late. Maybe I can find a way to honor my grandmother's sacrifices and still take care of my family." Several people nodded encouragingly. "I want to accept all the opportunities you've offered," David said. "The audition at the conservatory, the teaching positions, the performance opportunities. I want to try to build a life where I can support my family and still make music." The crowd erupted in applause again. Mrs. Patterson beamed with joy. "But," David continued, raising his hand for quiet, "I want to be honest with all of you. I'm scared. I've been away from music for a long time. I don't know if I'm good enough to succeed professionally, and I can't afford to fail because my family is counting on me." Dr. Mitchell stepped forward. "David, fear is normal. Every musician feels it. But fear shouldn't stop you from pursuing your talents. We'll help you succeed." Mrs. Patterson nodded firmly. "David, you won't be doing this alone. The foundation will support you financially while you get established, and everyone here tonight will help in whatever way we can." David looked around at all the supportive faces. These people barely knew him, but they were willing to invest in his future. It was overwhelming and humbling, "There's one more thing," David said. "I want to make sure my family understands what's happening. My mother and sister are depending on the money I send them. I need to explain to them why I'm making this change and make sure they're comfortable with it." "Of course," Mrs. Patterson said. "Family support is important. Would you like help explaining the situation to them?" David thought about it. Actually, yes. If Dr. Mitchell could talk to them about the conservatory program, and if you could explain about the foundation, it might help them understand that this isn't just a crazy dream. "I'd be happy to speak with your family," Dr. Mitchell said. "I've helped many students navigate these kinds of decisions." As the conversations continued, people began exchanging contact information with David. By the end of the evening, he had business cards from a dozen potential students, invitations to perform at several events, and detailed information about various opportunities. Marcus Wellington had been watching these interactions from a distance. Finally, he approached David. The room grew quiet as people wondered what Marcus would say. "David," Marcus said stiffly, "I owe you an apology. I judged you unfairly tonight, and I was wrong." 3 months after the night that changed everything, David Chen stood in front of a mirror in a small dressing room at the City Music Conservatory. He was wearing a black suit that Mrs. Patterson had helped him buy for special occasions. Tonight was his first public recital since returning to serious music study. David's hands were shaking slightly as he adjusted his tie. In 30 minutes, he would walk onto a stage and perform for an audience of 200 people. Among them would be Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Mitchell, his mother and sister, and even some of the people from the country club that night 3 months ago. The past 3 months had been the most challenging and rewarding of David's life. True to her word, Mrs. Patterson's foundation had provided him with enough money to support his family while he studied at the conservatory. David had been able to quit his janitor job and focus entirely on music for the first time in 6 years. Dr. Mitchell had designed a special program for David, combining intensive practice sessions with performance classes and music theory review. David had worked harder than he ever had before, practicing 6 to 8 hours every day. His fingers, which had grown soft from cleaning work, became strong and nimble again. The first few weeks had been difficult. David discovered that while his musical instincts were still strong, his technique needed serious work. 6 years away from the piano had left gaps in his abilities that required patient, methodical practice to fill. But David was motivated in a way he had never been before. Every morning when he woke up, he remembered the feeling of playing at the country club. He remembered his grandmother's dreams for him. He remembered his promise to find a way back to music. Dr. Mitchell had been amazed by David's progress. "In 30 years of teaching," he had told David just last week, "I've never seen anyone work as hard as you do. Your dedication is extraordinary." David had also begun teaching private students, just as Mrs. Patterson had suggested. Word had spread quickly about the talented young teacher, and he now had 15 regular students. The teaching work provided steady income and helped David feel more confident about supporting himself through music. Carlos, Maria's son, had been David's first student. The boy had shown real talent on the guitar David had given him, and he was eager to learn piano as well. Teaching Carlos reminded David of his own early lessons with his grandmother. "David," Carlos had said during a recent lesson, "my mom says you used to be a janitor like her. How did you become a piano teacher?" David had smiled at the question. "I never stopped being a musician, Carlos. I just forgot for a while." Tonight's recital was David's final exam for the conservatory program. He would perform 4 pieces, including the Chopin ballad that had started everything at the country club. But the program would also include the piece that meant the most to him, Clair de Lune, which he would dedicate to his grandmother's memory. A knock on the dressing room door interrupted David's thoughts. 5 minutes until showtime, called a voice from the hallway. David took a deep breath and looked at himself one more time in the mirror. He thought about how much his life had changed since that night at the country club. He was no longer the scared, discouraged janitor who had accepted Marcus Wellington's challenge. He was a musician again, and tonight he would prove it to himself and everyone else. David walked out of the dressing room and made his way to the side of the stage. He could hear the audience talking and settling into their seats. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see Mrs. Patterson in the front row, wearing an elegant dress and beaming with pride. Next to her sat his mother and sister, who had driven 3 hours to attend the recital. David's mother looked proud but nervous. She still worried about her son choosing music over a steady job, but she had been impressed by the support David was receiving from Mrs. Patterson and Dr. Mitchell. David's sister Maria was taking pictures with her phone, excited to share her brother's performance with her friends. In the third row, David spotted several familiar faces from the country club. Mr. Henderson was there with his wife and daughter. The woman in the blue dress, whose daughter was now one of David's students, sat nearby. Even Maria Santos, the waitress who had spoken up for David that night, had come to hear him play. Dr. Mitchell appeared at David's side. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," David admitted. "But good nervous, if that makes sense." Dr. Mitchell smiled. "It makes perfect sense. That's exactly how you should feel before an important performance. The nervousness means you care about doing well." "Dr. Mitchell," David said, "I want to thank you again for everything you've done for me. 3 months ago, I never imagined I would be here." "David," Dr. Mitchell replied, "I should be thanking you. Teaching someone with your dedication and talent has been one of the highlights of my career. You've reminded me why I became a music teacher in the first place." The house lights dimmed, and Dr. Mitchell walked onto the stage to introduce David. The audience grew quiet as he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have the privilege of hearing a truly remarkable young musician. David Chen's journey back to music is a story of talent, perseverance, and the power of community support. But most importantly, it's a story about never giving up on your dreams." David listened from the wings as Dr. Mitchell told a shortened version of his story. When Dr. Mitchell mentioned David's grandmother and her sacrifices, David felt tears forming in his eyes. "Please join me in welcoming David Chen," Dr. Mitchell concluded. David walked onto the stage to warm applause. The lights were bright, but he could see faces in the audience smiling encouragingly at him. He sat down at the beautiful grand piano and adjusted the bench. For a moment, David sat quietly with his hands resting on the keys. He thought about his grandmother, wishing she could be there to see this moment. He thought about the long journey that had brought him back to this place. Then he began to play. David's first piece was a Bach invention, precise and mathematical but also deeply expressive. His technique was flawless, the result of 3 months of intensive practice. The audience listened with complete attention as David's fingers danced across the keys. When the Bach piece ended, the applause was enthusiastic. David felt his confidence growing. He moved on to a Beethoven sonata, more dramatic and emotional than the Bach. David played with passion and control, showing both his technical skills and his musical understanding. During the Beethoven, David caught sight of Marcus Wellington in the back of the auditorium. The wealthy man who had challenged David 3 months ago sat quietly, listening with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. David felt no anger toward Marcus anymore. In a strange way, Marcus's cruel challenge had been the catalyst for everything good that had happened since. The third piece was a modern composition by a living American composer. David had chosen it because he wanted to show that he could perform contemporary music as well as classical pieces. The piece was technically challenging and emotionally complex, and David performed it with maturity and insight. As the final notes of the modern piece faded away, David prepared for the most important moment of the evening. He turned slightly toward the audience and spoke into the microphone. "For my final piece tonight, I'd like to play something very special to me. This is Clair de Lune by Claude Debussy. I dedicate this performance to my grandmother, Elena Chen, who sacrificed everything so that I could pursue music. Grandma, this is for you." The audience was completely silent as David began the gentle opening of Clair de Lune. From the first note, it was clear that this performance would be different from the others. This was not just a display of technical skill. This was David pouring his heart out through the piano. David played with incredible tenderness and emotion. Every note was perfect, but more than that, every note carried meaning. He was telling the story of his grandmother's love, his own struggles, and his journey back to music. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row with tears streaming down her cheeks. She had heard David play this piece at her house several times over the past 3 months, but tonight's performance was transcendent. She could feel the love and gratitude David had for his grandmother in every phrase. David's mother covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed by the beauty of her son's playing. She had known David was talented, but she had never fully understood the depth of his musical gifts until this moment. As the piece built to its emotional climax, David felt his grandmother's presence with him. He could almost hear her voice encouraging him, telling him how proud she was. The music flowed through him like a river, natural and inevitable. The final section of Clair de Lune was like a prayer of gratitude. David played with such gentleness that some notes seemed to barely exist, floating in the air like whispers. As he approached the last few measures, the audience held its breath. David played the final chord and let it ring in the silence. For several seconds, no one moved. The beauty of the performance seemed to hang in the air like a benediction. Then the applause began, and it was unlike anything David had ever experienced. The entire audience rose to their feet, clapping and calling out their appreciation. The ovation continued for nearly 5 minutes. David stood up from the piano bench and bowed, overwhelmed by the response. He could see,